All right. Jacob, with that little comedic interlude, I want to introduce you. Jacob is from Cal Poly Humboldt, and he will be continuing our conversation about sediment in the Klamath River, but from a very different angle. So, Jacob, when you're ready to share your screen and unmute, go ahead.
Yeah, should be all ready to go. You all see my slides right now, my title slide?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Great. Let me just move a couple things. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jacob Taylor, and I want to thank you all for having me today. I'm an undergrad environmental engineering student at Cal Poly Humboldt, and alongside with Jenny Curtis at the USGS, California Water Science Center, we conducted a study to develop a methodology of using pole-mounted photogrammetry to determine the relationship between surface roughness and digital grain size on gravel bars on the Klamath River. Today I'll be going over the objectives of the project, study sites and methods, and finally some results and implications of the project. So starting off with the objectives. This study was part of a larger USGS effort to use multiple methods to create a baseline data set of roughness and grain size characteristics of the lower stem of the Klamath River. Multiple methods have already been employed for this process to study both the exposed and submerged areas. For the exposed areas, the main method has been structure for motion and drone imagery. With the planned dam removal, it is imperative to get this baseline data and have repeat surveys to monitor textural changes. The objective of this particular study was to use a pole-mounted camera and structure for motion to create hyper-resolution digital surface models and orthomosaics. These models were then related using a linear regression between the topographic roughness and the digital grain size. So this study area map shows the Klamath Basin and my 4 study sites. The names of the locations are listed in downstream order with Klamath Community Center, going to Portuguese Creek, Ferry Point, and finally Big Bar. During the couple of weeks of field work, it was decided that more data should be collected at Big Bar, as the first day of surveys took a little bit longer than the rest, but by the end of the week, we had more time to come back and survey the upstream portion of Big Bar, which is why for the rest of the presentation, I'll have 5 different surveys for these 4 sites. In the future, there are several other sites that will be included in the repeat surveys that we're not able to get to before the fire season began in 2021. But in the future, there are 11 study sites of interest for monitoring these textural changes. Starting now with the methods of the project. As mentioned before, we use a pole-mounted camera to capture hundreds of images and put them together through a process known as photogrammetry or structure for motion. Photogrammetry, in simple terms, stitches together all the photos using pixel matching and alignment, then uses principles of perspective, geometry, and optics to calculate a 3-dimensional surface known as a digital surface model. The resultant digital surface model, or DSM, of the ground surface captures the variation in heights over the site. The second half of the products produced from photogrammetry is an orthomosaic, which is a seamless mosaic of all imagery, all put together, all corrected for camera lens distortion, and is the 2-dimensional counterpart to the DSM. It's important to note that it is also possible to put the survey data into real world coordinates, which is extremely useful for repeat surveys. So with the digital surface model, it is important to remove the trend of site scale elevation changes. We essentially flatten out the survey or the DSM through a method known as detrending. Detrending follows a process of interpolating a surface from mean elevations over the surface model, which provides an estimate of reach slope and bed form gradients. Once the surface is found, it's subtracted from the original DSM to produce a detrended relative elevation model. Then to get the roughness coefficient for, say, a 1 by 1 meter plot, it's simply a standard deviation of the detrended elevations over that area, arriving at a coefficient of roughness. So for our grain size distribution method, we achieved it through digital grain size analysis. There are many software that can calculate the grain size distribution from, say, a photo of the ground, but the one selected for this project is a digital grain size software developed by Buscom and implemented through a Python GUI framework. The method involves wavelet transformation, which in our case decomposes an image of sediment into variance as a function of frequency, which helps identify individual grains. The benefit of using digital grain size analysis is that there's a lot less physical work to be done and minimizes surface disturbance. The software uses wavelet analysis that does not necessarily require calibration. Though it does not require calibration, it will often overestimate the distribution due to smaller grain sizes being hidden under larger grains or the software not being able to resolve the fine matrix of the smaller grains. For the software to provide a good estimate of the grains in the image, they must be clearly resolved, and the higher the resolution, the better the software can detect those smaller grains. Now bringing the two components of the project back together, this was done through linear regression. Plots were randomly selected using built-in ArcGIS tools, and the D50 and D84 and roughness coefficients were calculated for these 1 by 1 meter plots. Vegetation was sort of an issue for us. We were just interested in the grains, not necessarily vegetation overgrowth that was occurring. So we would use a plot in the area around a randomly selected plot in a uniform manner, so to reduce the amount of subjectivity to the selection of plots. So this all allowed us for our independent variable of roughness to be related to the dependent grain size, either D50 or D84. We also completed an analysis of variance to measure the relative differences between our study sites. So first we collected all our data and we made our models. So imagery was successfully collected using a pole-mounted camera at the 4 sites, and surface models were created at each site. The models varied in resolution slightly between the sites, but they were all exported at a resolution of 3 millimeters per cell for the digital surface model and 1.5 millimeters per pixel for the orthomosaic models. Exporting all the models at the same resolution worked out nice for comparison's sake between sites. Shown in the figures, we have orthomosaic of Big Bar downstream, the downstream survey that we took. We took one downstream and upstream, as stated before. And we also have the 1 by 1 meter plot of the hillshade on top, which is representative of the DSM. And we also have a clipped orthomosaic plot on the bottom. Once the models were exported, they were randomly sampled, and the roughness calculations and the digital grain sizes were calculated. So using those values for roughness and grain size, we were able to do our linear regression analysis. Shown in these two figures are our models. On the left, we have the relationship between roughness and D50, and on the right, we have roughness and D84 across all of our sites. Our models range in quality with R-squared values ranging from 0.066 to 0.577 for D50, and 0.082 to 0.421 for D84. These models are useful to us in getting continuous grain size data over the site, as I'll show in a couple slides. Klamath Community Center produced, I would say, the worst regression models, and with very poor correlation due to there being poor sorting and a lot of imbrication from people driving over, and there's also a lot of vegetation in the area, which was a problem in our analysis. And it made our plots not, they weren't great for digital grain size. But at sites like Big Bar, we had lots of success with well-sorted and homogeneous plots, and we can see that there is a linear correlation between roughness and grain size. We also completed analysis of variance between sites to get an understanding of how the site's digital grain sizes compared. As you can see, Big Bar downstream had the smallest grain size distribution, and Portuguese Creek had the largest, and it got very coarse. This data shows that the methods are site-specific and variability should not be underestimated in its effect that it has on our regressions. So all this information is great, but what can we do with this? With our regression equations, we can now predict the D50 and D84 grain sizes for continuous data sets over any area that we have roughness values for. So basically anywhere that we have survey data. The map in the top right shows a big bar downstream again, but as the predicted D50 grain size. And you can see at the nose of the bar, we have lower grain sizes, and higher up on the bar, we have larger grains. For this site, we have a median value of about 53.9 for D50, which falls in the very coarse pebbles category, which makes sense. I mean, it's a coarse-grained river, and so we can expect to see those types of values. And we do get up to 153.7 for D50, but those values are heavily impacted by the vegetation. As you can see, the darker red color is where there's bushes and such, which affects the roughness calculation and should be somewhat ignored and considered outliers in this map. This prediction gives us a map of grain size and meets our goal of trying to characterize roughness and grain size on the Klamath River. We also compared our results to other empirical studies. Our range of D50 and roughness coefficient values in R-squared values were like those reported in other field studies for coarse-grained rivers. Our data fell within this ellipsoid drawn on this figure, where we have, again, D50 on the y-axis and standard deviation of elevations on the x-axis. So our regression equations are comparable to other empirical studies. We know these methods work better when the grains are more clearly resolved. The Klamath, again, is a very coarse-grained river, and our values spanned a larger range of values in comparison to these other studies. And because we use digital grain size, and our grain size estimates for D50 were truncated, so we don't have some of the data for those lower grain sizes. The regression models overall are very noisy due to randomness in the shape of grains, as well as how they're packed and sorted. Some other implications overall is that pole-mounted photogrammetry is fast, relatively accurate, and reproducible. This is important for continuous measurement of the Klamath Basin before and after dam removal. We will be able to monitor the surface grain size without disruptive techniques such as pebble counts or disruptive techniques such as pebble counts and volumetric sampling. While digital grain size analysis has some caveats, while it's not as accurate as field measurements due to the truncated distribution, it can still get very good relative measurements between sites. Further than just characterization on the Klamath River, it could easily be used as a hydraulic, not necessarily easily, but it could be used as a hydraulic modeling tuning parameter. Continuous data could provide extremely precise hydraulic modeling through rivers, which I find very exciting and interesting as an environmental engineer. So for future work, we're planning on moving to UAS-based cameras for larger surveys at similar quality of pole-mounted surveys. We just finished this last summer. We got some drone imagery at a lot of these sites and are during the roughness characterization and attempting digital grain size at a higher flight elevation than we were at the pole-mounted, which is going well. Future work could also be done using spectral methods to see how we could improve the models by removing vegetation data where vegetation overgrowth has occurred, because vegetation, again, has a really big impact on surface roughness values. Just one plant in your plot could throw off or could cause a outlier in your data. And finally, we just need to get out there and get our baseline characterization and see how the river changes after dam removal. Thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions now. It looks like I have a few more minutes, so thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. Does anyone have any questions in the room? All right, I'm going to go ahead. I see Mike Belchick, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hey, that's a great presentation, Jacob. My question has to do with like percent time that those areas that you surveyed are inundated and actually activated. And what about the underwater stuff?
Yeah, I'm not super sure about how often they're inundated. It's just it was right above the water level when we took the surveys. So I'm not exactly how often those are inundated. Can you repeat your second question too?
What about the underwater sediment?
Yeah,
In particular, I'm thinking about fines
yeah, that's
distributed at relatively lower flows.
yeah, that's a little bit outside of the scope from my project, but I know the USGS researchers are working on using something called site scan to look at underwater somewhat it's like elevation data but underwater. Yeah, that's all I have for that.
Great. Jacob, there's a question in the chat about did you compare any of your samples with pebble counts?
We didn't compare any of these surveys with, but we had previous data comparing digital grain size versus pebble counts, and it was pretty accurate. There is that truncated distribution where smaller grain sizes are missed out on, so the distribution slightly shifts to the right to larger grains.
Great. And Chauncey?
I just wanted to respond to Mike's earlier question about.
We're gonna
skip Jenny's online and
yeah.
answer that one.
Chauncey's gonna come up and see if Jenny's online and maybe can answer something.
Yeah, this is in response to Mike Belchek's initial question. Excuse me. Oh, not looking at that. Sorry. And Jenny, I don't know if you want to respond to that. I think that'd be a worthwhile thing to get out there.
Okay, so great question, Mike. Jacob's been primarily working in the exposed areas. So these are areas that are inundated annually or every 2 years. So in what we call the Q2 inundation boundary. So active alluvial bars. And then we have a group of folks that have been collecting side scan sonar data longitudinally along the river. That is an acoustic technology. And it collects, as Jacob mentioned, elevation data. We're also able to do a similar type of roughness analysis, but in that the data it's slightly different. We're using different tools for that analysis. Sandra Bond is the primary person who's working on that for us, and hopefully she's got some results, and so potentially be able to discuss that at an upcoming meeting.
Great. All right.
Just to follow up, so what I'm getting from that is that the exposed areas that are sampled are assumed to be inundated pretty much annually, like they're going to be exposed or inundated at winter base flow or winter flows.
I would say at the end by the annual peak flow.
Okay.
So, so the two technologies require that you collect the data at different flows. So for the exposed areas, you want to collect during low flows. And for the submerged areas, the more water that's in the channel, then the more space that you have for surveying. And so one of the challenges with these are both remote sensing technologies, and one of the challenges is always the shallow water environments. So actually the drone imagery and the pole mounted imagery, we get some data in submerged areas. So the shallowest water, I would say probably on the order of like, I don't know, 30 centimeters to half a meter potentially, Jacob. You might have a better idea about that. And then for the side scan sonar and multi-beam work that we're doing, that requires that we usually are doing a single trace or multiple passes in a pool, and it's really challenging to get into the shallower water environments. So for these types of remote sensing technologies, shallow water environments are the challenge.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We are going to go into our first break.